Greetings, children. Today we are going to deal with the lesson The Portrait of a Lady. It's for class 11 CBSE students. This story is written by Khushwant Singh. It's a tribute to his grandma. Lady here means the grandma of Khushwant Singh. Portrait is the pen picture, not a painting, but a description of the grandma in wonderful words. That is Portrait of a Lady, written by Khushwant Singh. Let us move on to the story. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. The very beginning of the story is very interesting. He universalized the grandma in the story. His grandma, like everybody's grandma, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. This grandma remained at the same old age or same oldness with wrinkles for the last 20 years. For the last 20 years. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband. But that was hard to believe. People here means Khushwant Singh's parents and other elders of the family. They said that she had once been young and pretty. This grandma was once, she was so young and a pretty woman and even had a husband. But that was hard to believe. Hard here means difficult to believe. It was a difficult thing for Khushwant Singh to believe that this woman had a husband. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. Now Khushwant Singh gives a picture of his grandfather, this grandma's husband, or better part, his portrait. Portrait here means the picture of Khushwant Singh's grandfather hung above the mantelpiece. Mantelpiece is a shelf in the wall. The portrait hung. Hung is the past tense of hang. That is hung above the mantelpiece of the drawing room. He wore a big turban. Turban is the headgear that usually the Sikh people wear, and loose fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest and he looked at least 100 years old. This is the picture Khushwant Singh gives us about his grandfather. He wears white beard. That white beard covered the best part of his chest and he looks at least 100 years old, this grandpa. He did not look a sort of person who would have a wife or children. Again, the fallacy thought of Khushwant Singh gives here. He could not believe his rational senses and believing that he did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. He simply seemed that this man had only lots and lots of grandchildren. His sense did not allow him to go back to this man's young age and believing that he married a woman and he had children and all those things remained as a fallacy. in his mind. As for my grandmother, being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. Revolting means extremely unpleasant. But this fallacy of thought was almost revolting when we consider the grandmother being young and pretty. The thought was almost revolting. The thought was almost contradictory one because the grandma was a beautiful woman, a pretty woman. So, thinking that she had not any husband or a family, that was almost revolting. Look at the next sentence. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. This grandma, like everybody's grandma, used to tell the games she used to play as a child that seemed quite absurd and undignified. Absurd means silly in a humorous way, undignified means making you silly. The games, the stories, the grandma used to tell Khushwant Singh and other children seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part. And the children in the house treated these stories like the fables. Fables here means the moral stories. Like they treated these games as moral stories of the prophets she used to tell us. This grandma was simply telling certain moral stories of the prophets. They simply thought like this. The expression that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part means the author would never believe his grandmother when she used to tell him about the games she used to play in her childhood. The narrator Khushwant Singh believed so because he thought her grandmother had always been old. She had been the same all the time he had known her. This is the fallacy. Come to the second paragraph. She had always been short, fat, and slightly bent. This is the physical explanation, physical description of the grandmother. She was short, she was a fat woman, she had a slight bend while she was walking. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles, running from everywhere to everywhere, which means that all over her face and body you can see the crisscross of wrinkles like in a crow's paw. There you can see crisscross of lines running from all directions, from one direction to all directions, that is from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain means Khushwant Singh and his generation were certain about she had always been as had known her. This grandma had been at the same old stage when they had known her. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older. He exclaimed that she was terribly old woman and she could not have grown older, which means that she had grown old at its maximum. She had grown at its maximum. That was the grandson's comment about this grandma, and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. This the second time he says that this grandma had stayed at the same age for the last 20 years, which means that from the point when he started watching this grandma, she remained at the same physical condition without growing much because she had already grown older. The maximum old age came to her, according to the grandson. She could never have been pretty. because she lost her attractiveness as a youthful figure, but she was always beautiful. But as a old woman, but as an old woman, she was always beautiful, even though prettiness that lacks in her, that attractiveness, something that lost in her, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. He further describes the grandma that she hobbled about the house. Hobbled here means to walk with difficulty. Because of old age and the slight bend, she hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist. Spotless white. Spotless here means without any stain. Without any stain. She walked around the house and premises in white clothes, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop. She walked in such a way, she always kept one hand on her waist for balancing her stoop. Stoop here means the bend or crouch or the lean forward. To rectify that stoop, that bend, she kept one hand on her waist. That is a balancing act. And the other telling the beads of her rosary. The other hand she used it to count the beads of her rosary. Rosary means prayer beads. She always counting the beads of her rosary, which means that she was a religious woman. She always followed that prayers while she was hobbling around the house and premises. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face. Her silver locks here means the gray hair, the white hair that is scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face. Pale means the discolored, the colorless face, and the puckered face. Puckered here means the wrinkled face. Her white hair that fall across her puckered face or pale face, and her lips constantly moved. Constantly here means continually or continuously moved in inaudible prayer. That was not much audible, but she always used it to pray. She was a religious woman. She followed strictly the religious life of a Sikh. She used it to pray always. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains. Once again, Khushwant Singh says that yes, she was beautiful. No other way he can explain her. She was a beautiful woman. She was like the winter landscape. Then he compares the grandma with the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity. What is a winter landscape? A winter landscape is an expanse of pure white serenity. Expanse here means a stretch or an area or a stretch, that expanse of pure white serenity. Serenity means calmness or tranquility. A stretch of calmness, a stretch of tranquility, or a stretch of peace, breathing peace and contentment. That landscape is always breathing peace and contentment. Contentment here means happiness or satisfaction or peace. She is the symbol of contentment and peace, happiness or satisfaction and peace. She is a paragon of happiness. She is a paragon of peace. That is why Khushwant Singh compares her with an expanse of pure white serenity. The literary device of simile is used here. She was like the winter landscape. Here, Khushwant Singh compares her grandmother with the landscape of a mountain area. Further, he says that the winter landscape is an expanse of pure white serenity, a stretch of tranquility, a stretch of calmness that always breathing peace and contentment, that always gives us, that always breathe, that always live. Breathing here means living, living peace and contentment, that providing us that happiness and peace. She always live in such a wonderful, satisfied life. That is what Khushwant Singh says about his grandma.